On the other hand, we do have to find some way, don't we, of talking about literature that is valuable and worth reading. When you ask the question, what shall I read? Tell me something that is worth reading. An answer you don't want is a kind of set of equivocations and qualifications about whether you should describe a book as good or not. You want to be told by somebody who's read a lot whether this novelist, that poet, is worth reading. Now, of course, that's hugely problematic in itself because we all want to decide for ourselves what is worth reading. I might find a famous classic novel very difficult to read and not enjoy it. And that may be my fault as a reader. But we do have to preserve, don't we, as readers, some sense of what's literary and valuable.
Yes.
Do you think this problematic term, challenging term, that we're restless about, but we somehow don't seem quite to be able to do without, do you think understanding any of its history is a useful way of trying to evaluate it now?
I think the whole question of the history of the term literary is really of crucial importance. And I referred earlier to the fact that Victorian fiction, like by Dickens, by Trollope, by other writers, who we now consider as to be classics, were originally written to entertain, written for a wide public to entertain, and now they've been sort of packaged as literary novels. And really, this kind of goes back to the late 19th century when English literature was first really established as a subject of study. And it was established as a subject of study in universities, really from the late 19th century, around the time that universities were being opened up, well, a little bit opened up to women, to people from different social classes to a certain degree. And there's also a broadening out of the subject. So before really the late Victorian period, if you wanted to study literature at university, you studied the classics, Greek and Latin. But from the late 19th century and early 20th century, English literature becomes established as an academic discipline. And in the 1930s, F.R. Leavis, a Cambridge academic, really tried to beef up the subject and to turn it into a subject of academic interrogation and intellectual acuity. And he did this by attempting to establish a canon of great books that he considered to be worth studying. He put certain novelists in this canon and he left others out. And Leavis's suggestions about what's good to read and what's not to read has been very influential. It's also been hugely controversial, but he's nonetheless kind of instrumental in the history of the subject of English literature and the whole concept of the literary.
I think it's worth adding, isn't it, that for Leavis, the whole question of what was literature as opposed to what was, well, they were simply books, what was worth the title of literature was that which had a kind of moral integrity to it.
That's right.
Now, you're not seeing here only a judgment about literature in terms of how the language worked, how long a text was, what its themes were necessarily. You were seeing it also in terms of a kind of powerful moral judgment which the novel made, or the poem, about life itself, about lived experience. Leavis's critical conception of literature is difficult to summarise in a neat term, but it was deeply involved, wasn't it, in this sense that a literary text worthy of the name had a moral status. It was almost as if it had moved out of the sacred within Christian discourse and had appeared in literary criticism as something to be revered for its power.
So that's where George Eliot really comes in for Leavis, isn't it?
Indeed.
So as a writer who can give us advice, if you like, of how to live a good life, who has that kind of moral clarity.
Yes.
about her writing.
And you can see, anyway, can't you, from all of this, that these notions that are very influential on the shaping of literary criticism in the 20th century have, for the later part of the 20th century, become very problematic. So the notion of literature and the literary has inherited all of these questions about moral value, which have made people quite nervous. But perhaps we should try to draw this to some kind of conclusion by thinking about whether you and I find this term, this quixotic, slippery term, of any use to us, either as readers or of critics. So perhaps you could tell us, Katie, just a bit about whether you find it helpful. Do you use the term in your own mind, literary?
I find the term quite difficult because of the kind of work I do. I've done a lot of work on James Joyce, and at the moment I'm writing this book on shopgirls and typists and barmaids, which looks at literary writing as we might understand it. Novels by people like Joyce and Henry James and Anthony Trollope and Virginia Woolf. It looks at those novels alongside very much non-literary sources, which might include Mills and Boon novels, popular romances, musical comedies, which were the kind of, the big musicals of the day, musical acts, beauty competitions. And so really my work is about interrogating this whole idea of cultural value that we've been talking about today and what the literary is. And I write in my book I analyse romantic fiction. For example, there's a novel called Shopgirls by Arthur Applin, which is published by Mills and Boon in 1914. And if you read it now, you think, well, this is just a Cinderella fantasy. It's a romantic fiction. But nonetheless, it has interest and value for me, not least because of the way it's in dialogue with much more famous and better-known novels, for example, Joyce's Ulysses, or Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So I see these correspondences between the non-literary and the literary, which perhaps undercuts the idea of the literary as a category that's hermetically sealed, that isn't in dialogue with cultural forms outside its remit. And I also think that really that's a lot of contemporary and literary criticism, really from the 1960s, has been doing this kind of cultural studies work and reassessing questions of value. One of the ways it does that, for example, is thinking about song lyrics and thinking whether song lyrics can be poetry. And the poetry critic Christopher Ricks has made a career out of arguing that Bob Dylan's music can be classed as poetry. So that kind of question of literariness, I think, has been rather exploded since the 1960s, and that's something that I'm quite interested in.
Yes, I mean, we should perhaps say, shouldn't we, that, of course, Ricks has also made a career out of those great canonical poets,
yes.
out of Milton, out of Tennyson. And there's an interest for him, isn't there, in talking about the literariness of Bob Dylan.
Yes.
So it's not perhaps quite as simple as to say a recognition of something which is and isn't literary. Mm-hmm. I think and I think this was probably where you and I would slightly part company on how useful the literary was. Because for me, as a reader and a writer about literary texts, I absolutely agree that there are all kinds of wonderful, stimulating and exciting forms of writing that we can read in relation to literature. But I would still personally want to maintain that there was something distinctive and exceptional about, okay, let's use it, the literary. And that literariness is hard to define, and it's often a kind of category that comes into existence, into clarity, later on in a novel or a poem's lifetime, it seems to me. There is a quality of endurance about the literary, which it's not a guarantee, don't get me wrong, and there are plenty of great texts that have been forgotten, and there are some surprising texts that have survived, and it's quite hard to know why. But nonetheless, it is a very important indicator of something that is genuinely worth reading, and that, in my terms, for me, looking to be excited by what I'm reading, it gives back, the literary gives back to me far more than I, as a reader or critic, bring to it.
Yes, to be sure. And that, in a sense, that's what a literary prize attempts to do, doesn't it? It attempts to second guess or to predict what novels are going to be literary in the future, what novels are going to persist in the way that you describe.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.